Oh, thank you very much, Yasmin. Great to be with you. Thank you to you and Maria for putting on this great event, which has over 1,000 people listening. I'm the least interesting speaker on here. I've looked at the panel. I think it's such a wonderful panel, such great experience across the board, and at the very cutting edge of manufacturing and space and so on. So for me, I'm looking forward to learning a lot today. Before I go into the substance of my remarks, I do want to commend Advance, and I look forward as ambassador to doing more with Advance in the future. It's important for us to make the best use of our diaspora because our diaspora are in such influential and innovative positions across the world, all sorts of sectors and industries. So from my perspective, Advance is very important as part of our efforts of tapping into global talent, encouraging expatriates to think about coming home and bringing their expertise and their technical know-how with them. So, ladies and gentlemen, with that, I just want to get going with my main remarks. I suppose the first point to make is we're talking about manufacturing. So what is that? I mean, at its basic, it's the transformation of goods, materials, or substances into new products. And advanced manufacturing is the use of innovative technology to improve products or processes. Now, there was a period there where traditionally manufacturing in Australia was seen as inward-looking, fragmented, and needing tariff protection in order to be able to survive. And of course, that was not a recipe for encouraging globally competitive, globally recognized brands. And of course, with the globalization that occurred, particularly from the 80s going on, and with a great set of reforms through the 80s and 90s in Australia, we became a far more outwardly oriented economy. And while manufacturing contracted, the economy as a whole grew very strongly. And indeed, we had virtually 30 years of unbroken growth. So why worry about manufacturing? Well, I think manufacturing is important for a number of reasons. We need a smart manufacturing sector that is internationally competitive because it's a source of high wage, high productivity jobs. And as COVID-19 has shown, also a secure source of supply during global disruptions. Building the sector means focusing on our sources of comparative advantage. And energy in the past was a major advantage that we had, and the government is seeking to address that now. And because we aspire to be a high-wage country, there's a need for innovation and productivity to improve our competitiveness. So that requires harnessing our world-class science and innovation. And by doing that, we take production away from being commoditized and low value into being customized and high value, and therefore able to generate premia, particularly in international markets. And research is important because when we do research, it can catalyze new products and processes. And if we're on the ground floor of new manufacturing, we get a head start. It helps us to create an advantage. And that can mean being a premium producer in world markets. Customizing our production can be very important. Now, we punch above our weight in science and research. So my message is that that is a source of competitive advantage for Australia. We haven't always looked at it in those terms, but from what I've seen over the years, including in my period as industry minister, is we are world beaters in so many sectors. And in a sense, the only thing that limits us is our own imagination and capacity for thinking big. So what I'd like to see is us increasingly building on that science and research to be innovation leaders rather than followers, so that we're actually sitting at the top of the production and technology frontier. That's very important, I think. As part of my role here, I'm talking to the US government and to other governments about how, for example, we influence the standards which are set for various industrial products and processes, because by doing that, we can help to maximise the capacity of Australian companies that innovate, help set those standards and influence global standards, and therefore be more competitive internationally. So as I sit back and look at the US at the moment, I know that this won't come as a complete surprise to you, but COVID-19 is acting as a bit of an accelerant of trends that were already there. The trends around questioning globalization, trends around what to do with China or the engagement with China. Now, globalization was already under threat from populist backlash prompting protectionist pressures. And COVID-19 has sparked a debate here about global supply chains, onshoring of production, and identifying strategic sectors or industries. We've seen during the COVID-19 crisis here in the States, the Defence Production Act used to prioritise domestic production and consumption of things like personal protective equipment. And now there's a debate going on in government circles about how best to support US industry going forward. Is it through instruments like taxes and generic subsidies, or is it through more industry-specific interventions? And that, of course, is a debate that has major implications for us. COVID-19 has also heightened the tensions between the US and China, intensifying calls for decoupling in trade, investment, and research. Now, from our point of view, we're not in a position where we can produce everything. So for us, international trade remains very important. And we've got to be aware of cries of self-sufficiency and national security as a cover for increasing protection. Because in an aggregate sense, lower trade volumes will hamper the global recovery and make us poorer, particularly those in lower income countries. So the rationale for why we should intervene in these circumstances has to be clear. And what we are increasingly seeing is that governments add value by marshalling resources to undertake activities that are either beyond the private sector because of risk appetite, or the time horizon is so lengthy. A classic case of this is the sort of blue sky research that often mission oriented that went into things like the moon program and the moon landing. The way the US was able to marshal its resources, both public and private, to bring that about. And what I'm observing as I am here in the States, I've become even optimistic about the capacity of the US to keep reinventing itself. I don't buy this narrative that the US is somehow inevitably declining or losing power. For those of you who have the time, I think there's a great book by a guy called Bu Srinivasan. It's called A 400-Year History of American Capitalism, which superbly documents the way in which America over 400 years has reinvented itself, and the fact that this has often been synergistic, the public and private sectors working together. And as we face up now to the strategic competition with China in particular, we shouldn't discount the capacity of the US to be able to meet that threat, but it's not up to the US alone. China is on track to potentially exceed the R&D of the Five Eyes partners combined over the next few years. That gives you a sense of how big the challenge will be going forward. And the US is reaching out to trusted partners like Australia, and that creates great new opportunities for smart Australian companies. So this is my long-winded way of saying that we're getting to a point where I think the US is far more receptive to dealing with trusted partners like Australia in terms of taking science and innovation forward in a cooperative fashion and using that to underpin potentially refashioned supply chains in which we can play a bigger role. And these are opportunities that will build on our comparative advantage and can be facilitated by strategic government involvement. So defence industry and material is probably the best example here. As you may recall, the 2016 Defence White Paper and an integrated investment program had a vision of a sovereign and export-oriented defence industrial policy, building sovereign capability in such advanced areas as the submarine program. Our submarines will be the most advanced in the world when they're built. And also a focus on stimulating defence exports to capitalise on investment in advanced weapon systems. And now, while we're deeply engaged in the US system, there's plenty of scope to go further. And I think this is a big opportunity for defence and advanced manufacturing in Australia. We particularly want to become more embedded in the national technology and industrial base as a supplier of advanced capabilities here. The aspiration would be to create, if possible among the Five Eyes, a defence free trade area. We're also exploring how our involvement with the major R&D agencies, such as the Defence Advanced Research Project Agency and the other ARPAs, there's DARPA, and then there's ARPA in the energy space, there's ARPA in the biomedical space. Now, these are major technology spenders, which can create great commercial spin-offs. And it's important for us, of course, to get involved. And I've been impressed by government-funded venture capital companies like Incutel, which invest in software, infrastructure, and material sciences startups to deliver critical cutting-edge technologies to the defence and intelligence communities. As part of this process, we're setting up a dialogue around frontier technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, and the like. We're in the process of putting together a dialogue on critical minerals so we can, with the American government, look at ways we can improve the production and processing of critical minerals, most of which are at the moment dominated by China. I think that's going to be very important going forward. And that in itself will create processing opportunities within Australia. The trick there is to have a customer. At the moment, the Department of Defence here is a potential customer with Linus Corporation on a major contract that's being let at the moment. The other area which has become front of mind for us here in the US is space industry. There's a lot of work going on to capitalise on the $150 million that the Prime Minister announced as part of a space industry development program, which will embed us in the supply chains that work with NASA and others. Just in closing, my mission here in the US, apart from anything else, is to learn as much as I can about how the US does science and innovation and what are the lessons we can learn. The area I'm particularly interested in is around commercialisation and collaboration. We do it better in Australia than we once did, but we still have room to do better. And this is something I'm keen to see, whether the differences between the two countries are cultural or whether there are specific things we can do which can incentivise the greater collaboration between industry, researchers and academia. Finally, a lot of the work I do here is to attract American investment into Australia. We talked before about advance and looking for global talent. But foreign direct investment in Australia, very important to us. And one of the pitches I make to investors here is that we have these clusters which can promote innovation, whether it's the medtech precincts that we've got in Sydney and Melbourne, whether it's the Nuclear Science and Technology Organisation's Innovation Cluster in southern Sydney, which will have the world's first nuclear science and technology incubator, a graduate institute, and a business park associated with it. I promote the clusters because by bringing together industry, research, and academics and others, that creates the synergy of co-location, which leads to commercialisation and collaboration. Now, I've roamed around the paddock a bit, so I'm going to conclude my remarks there. But the important point I want to make is there's great opportunity here in the States. great opportunity for us to work with Australian companies in a lot of these science and tech areas, particularly those where government is a major player here. So advanced manufacturing has a bright future as long as we recognise science and technology is a comparative advantage, a competitive advantage of Australia. Thanks, Maria.